Hi guys. So today we're starting our unit where we look at sex and um, abortion, and we'll be getting into some other issues such as prostitution, homosexuality, polygamy, gender identity, and sexual harassment. Um, the lecture today probably will just focus on sex and abortion. And then the next lecture will get into homosexuality, polygamy, polyamory, gender identity, and sexual harassment. So as we begin this, just a couple of things that I will just share with you briefly, just so that you'll know. My dissertation was on Playboy magazine, which, by the way, was ruled by the Supreme Court as it is not pornography. That was not the case with some other magazines. So, we could have a discussion about pornography and what it is and what it isn't. I forget, was it Chief Justice Warren, who said, I don't know what pornography is, but I know it when I see it. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. I don't want to don't want to go down that road right now. But when we talk about sex, so as I was saying, my dissertation was on Playboy magazine. In particular, I looked at religion in Playboy magazine. So I really could talk about this quite a bit. A couple of experiences that I had when I was in Southeast Asia. One, I was doing a study tour, and I was the only male in a group of 7, and a couple of the women wanted to go to a local club called Telephone, and it was known for older Western men picking up underage Thai boys. And it was quite remarkable experience for us to go there and to see this pretty much in the open. On another night, I went to a club in the night market where I was propositioned, for lack of a better term, and I got out of there pretty quickly because I was quite afraid of the environment. And we hear about sexual issues in the news quite often. The whole thing with Jeffrey Epstein that has been in the news in the past year. Some people made a point of saying that when it was first reported, the news was about him having sex with, quote, underage women. Of course, that was later, corrected, and people started saying, no, it's not underage women. He raped girls. Let's be clear about what happened there. But just to go back in time a little bit, when I was a bit younger, in high school, sex was in the news a lot then as well. So we're talking about in the 80s and early 90s. I remember in the 80s there were a couple of sexual scandals regarding religious figures, in particular Jimmy Swaggart and Jim Bakker, which, by the way, both of their the women with whom they had affairs were featured in Playboy magazine later. And then in the early 90s, there was, or in the later 90s, there was Bill Clinton and his affair with Monica Lewinsky. I can tell you of a couple of politicians, Gary Hart, for example, he was running for president, doing very well on the Democratic side. It was the primaries, and there was a photo that came out of him on a boat with a young woman sitting on his lap, and he dropped out of the case, out of the campaign. There was another one, John Edwards. It was revealed that he had an affair and had a child out of marriage with a woman, and he dropped out of the race. Now, when you compare that to Donald Trump today, and the fact that he made the Access Hollywood admission about being able to, I'm sorry, I'm just going to say assault women, is what it sounded like he was admitting to. But we also know that he paid to cover up sexual affairs with two other women. These are the ones that came to light, and of course, multiple accusations about sexual assault. It's somewhat stunning where we are with our understanding of sex nowadays. So, with that in mind, it began, with sex being so much around us, it begins to, at least for me, to raise some questions that I think are important for us to begin to contemplate, such as who should have sex, when is sex, and with whom you're having sex, something that is important to other people. At what age is it none of anyone else's business? In what cases is it someone else's business? What is sex? What qualifies as sex? Is it oral sex, anal sex, homosexual sex, heterosexual sex? I remember one of the episodes of Seinfeld. I told you I thought television began and ended with Seinfeld, or at least ended with Seinfeld. I've seen nothing good on regular television since then. This discussion comes up between Jerry and Elaine, and I think it's Jerry who says, I think it's when the nipple makes an appearance. So, in the 90s, there was this question about whether or not, that was qualified as sex. What about masturbation? What about mutual masturbation? Is that sex? If you engage in masturbation with a partner, have you engaged in sex? What should one disclose about sexual diseases? So if you know that you have an STD, are you obligated to share that in every instance with your sexual partner? What about sexual dysfunction? There are varieties of sexual dysfunction. It's not all having to do with libido. What about disclosing the number of sexual partners that you've had in your life? What should one say about, or when should one have a conversation with a potential partner about sex? And if you go on some dating sites, it asks the question, after how many dates is it acceptable to have sex? First date, second date, third date, 10th date. All of these questions, is marriage, should that be a prerequisite to having sex? Or, what age is too young to have sex? Is 15 too young? Well, if 15 is too young, what about 16? 16 is okay, but 15 is not. What makes that determination? Um, in the 1940s and the 1950s, there was a report released by Alfred Kinsey. And incidentally, I think there was a movie. Liam Neeson, I believe, played Alfred Kinsey. Um, and the Kinsey report was released in 1947, and the second report in 1953, and it was entitled Sexual Behavior in the American Male and then Sexual Behavior in the American Female. And what Kinsey found is that even back then, so we're talking some 80 years ago almost now, that Americans were not really being honest about their, I guess that would be 70 years. Americans were not being honest about their sexual activity. They were being much more sexually active than what they were talking about or how they were portraying that. Um, and so he found that Americans were having a lot more sex than they were reporting, and he found that they were having varieties of sex beyond just the missionary style that was often kind of, if you see that era portrayed in television or anything, that there was a lot more sex and a lot of variety to sex. And of course, we could even raise questions, beyond, this about prostitution. Um, and if you can sell your labor, why isn't sex considered a labor that you could sell? Of course, there have been other things to enter into this. We could talk about the AIDS scare of the late 70s into the 80s, and how that really changed how Americans were having sex. We could ask other questions. What about sexual education? What should be taught in school? Or should schools stay out of the business of teaching sex education? What about abstinence? Should schools teach abstinence? Should young people be taught abstinence? And how does teaching abstinence change the way young people approach sex when they do begin to experiment? And, let's face it, late adolescence, beginning 15, 16 and beyond, is when people really begin to experiment with sex. I'm not saying, that people have to have sex then. I'm saying that developmentally, those are the ages when young people begin to have sex. Um, and so, how does that um, really affect a person if if they have been taught abstinence versus if they have been taught safe sex education? And how did religion get so tied up with sex? I'd like to tackle that one right now, just a little brief history for you. Um, if you go into the Hebrew scripture, which is commonly referred to as the Old Testament, and it is held as sacred by Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. Sex there it comes from a Hebrew word yada, meaning to know. And so that gives rise to the euphemism, he knew her biblically, or I know him, she knows him biblically speaking. That there, the word know, again, in the Hebrew is yada. And it's also where, the phrase yada, yada, yada comes from, to know, to know, to know, Um, and so to know someone in that sense uh, has the connotation of an intimacy, a deep intimacy with another person that would, transcends kind of the ordinary, um, just hello, how are you, nice to meet you type of thing. So in the Hebrew scriptures, that's really where it is. If you take it into the Christian scriptures, um, Jesus really doesn't address the issue of sex. One woman, at one point there's a woman taken in adultery that's presented to Jesus, um, and they expect him to condemn her for her sexual activity. And Jesus writes in the ground. We don't know what he wrote in the ground. Maybe it's a list of some speculated maybe it was a list of the sexual activities by the people who were accusing her. And so they all went away without further accusation to her, because he says, he that's without sin cast the first stone. And so it would seem that Jesus is rather permissive in his understanding about what sexual activity is permissible in that sense. Now, by the time we get to the epistles and Paul, we find some interesting, especially Paul, we find some interesting admonitions about it is better to marry than to burn. So that if you're not sexually active, if you're a virgin, whether male or female, it's better to stay that way. But if you don't want to do that, then you really should marry, because the marriage bed can't be defiled, which seems to indicate that any sexual act between a married couple would be permissible. And we also know that in the ancient world, sex was quite, people's attitudes about sex was quite liberal. In fact, even some forms of worship one form of worship was to engage in sex, or in some cases to, if you were a male, to spill one's seed up on the ground. Now, here's the thing. In the ancient world, women were largely considered to be empty vessels. Sorry, women, this is just the way it was in the ancient world. Women were empty vessels, and they had one purpose: to receive the seed, and that's what male semen, a male ejaculate, was referred to as, to receive the seed of the male. And the woman was then to be the fertile ground in which that seed would grow and produce. This is before we knew of women having eggs and ovulation and all of that. All that we knew is that men produced something and they put it into the woman, and as a result, the woman would become pregnant. Now, so that's why women were seen as empty vessels. And therefore, when you read something like the story of Adam and Eve, and you bring it all up through the ancient religious world, at least the Western religions, women are more seen as more of the passive, receptive vessel in this. And so it's not really all that much to worry about. So it's when we get to an early church leader by the name of Augustine of Hippo. Augustine, commonly known as Saint Augustine, had lived a life which was quite promiscuous. Augustine, before he became a Christian, he was sexually active, he enjoyed sex, and he enjoyed philosophy. And this was kind of his life. He really didn't see a need to live in any other fashion, in any other way. But his mother, his father was not a Christian, but his mother was a devout Christian. Her name was Monica. And his mother, being a devout Christian, prayed for his conversion. And eventually, Augustine was converted to Christianity. And when Augustine was converted to Christianity, he still didn't want to give up the world of philosophy. And by the way, when you don't give up philosophy and you do it within the context of religion, sometimes it's called theology. And so Augustine's pursuit then became what is now, what is today known as early Christian theology. And so Augustine was trying to reconcile, and he tells about his life in the Confessions. He tells how promiscuous and how liberal his attitudes about sex was prior to his conversion. But once he is converted, he feels incredibly guilty about his past sexual activities. So Augustine was feeling quite guilty about his past sexual activity, and he was trying to reconcile it with his new found faith, and how could he possibly, um, uh, you know, uh, be a Christian and get beyond that. And so in his study, he came across a passage of scripture from Psalm chapter 51, verse 5. So Psalm 51, verse 5, and it talks about, in sin I was conceived, and in sin my mother, um, in sin I was conceived, and in sin I was born. Um, and so Augustine then began to think about, how could it be that you were conceived in sin? And so he took it back to the story of Adam and Eve. And in that story of Adam and Eve, he was trying to figure out what was that sin that they committed, that was so horrible that it got them punished by God. Remember, they're taking these stories quite literally. Um, and so he fathomed and put forward the idea that the only thing that they could possibly do, um, that would um, get them kicked out of the Garden of Eden was that they had sex with each other. And when they had sex with each other, um, uh, this was so displeasing to God that God kicked them out of the garden. But and so everyone else then is born outside of the garden, through no fault of their own. You're just born outside of the garden because you're kicked out of the garden because Adam and Eve were kicked out. And so Augustine then tried to reason then about this, and taking this verse of scripture, Psalm 51, verse 5, in sin I was conceived, he began to realize that sin then is passed on to people not because of the sex that they have, but sin is transmitted to people because of the fact that they are born as a result of sex. So the fact that your parents had sex, they did the nasty, and you were conceived, that then means that you are born stained with what Augustine and others then would begin to call original sin. And so as a result of that, we're all born with original sin. And the only way that original sin can be expunged from us is through Christ, eventually, is what he's going to conclude. And so, as a result of this, again, we're talking, this is around the year 400 BCE. I'm sorry, 400 CE. And as a result of this, the only safe sex is either in marriage or no sex at all. And so eventually, this will become adopted by the church as the doctrine of original sin, and eventually any sex outside of marriage is considered sinful sex, and the only norm for sex is abstinence. That's eventually, this is going to take hundreds of years to get to these positions, but eventually, and that's part of why clergy, Roman Catholic priests, are largely believed to should be celibate, because that is the only way to abstain from sin. So even marital sex is sinful sex, but at least it's okay within that context, because the goal then is procreation. The goal is to reproduce children. Um, and so this is, this idea of original sin and being attached to sex comes down. And it doesn't matter if you're Protestant or Roman Catholic. This idea of original sin being passed down, not because of any act or anything that you do, but because you are conceived through the sexual act. And of course, the question is, well, what if you're conceived? What if somebody is a test tube? What if they put the egg and the sperm together? It doesn't matter. That's still sexual reproduction. It still takes the product of a female and the product of a male, and it's the union of those. If we can somehow create life, not using, if you can create human life not using human DNA, then maybe you can get around original sin. But we know that that's impossible. Even if we could clone, for example, a woman could be cloned. And I say a woman because they theorize that it would be possible for women at some point to reproduce without men. So even if a woman could clone, somewhere back in that lineage, there was the sex act. And because there was the sex act, anything that comes from that, the fruit of that in any way, is tainted and ruined. And so is something then that, that everyone is born with original sin. Now this, by the way, this whole idea that women are vessels is where we get a lot of the idea that Jesus could be born without sin, because it is believed that God was his father, Mary being this empty, pure vessel, pure meaning virginal vessel, in which God somehow put God's seed, gives rise to the whole idea then that Jesus could be born without sin. Because there was no earthly male, it was God, and the woman is just a vessel. And so if you can, I'm not going into that. You have to take my religion course to get into that. But in those cases, then one can be, and that's why Jesus is believed to have been born without sin. So before I go any further into this and begin to talk about abortion, and before we leave the idea of sex altogether, I want to leave you in this part of it with 4 questions to consider when we talk about moral sex. So, how is it, how would you define moral sex? And so these 4 questions I offer to you. Number 1, what do I want sex to mean? What is it that I really want the sexual act to mean? Number 2, does my partner's understanding of sex match my understanding of sex? So do we have the same idea and meaning about sex, and does my partner share that view? Number 3, does the sex show self-respect and respect for my partner? So does it show self-respect and respect for my partner? And then number 4, am I choosing to have sex, or is my decision coerced or influenced? For example, as under drugs, alcohol or some misled obsession. So am I choosing to have sex, or is my decision or my judgment coerced or influenced in some way? So these are questions to consider as we approach the whole idea of sex. Now, with that, I want to go a little bit further in the idea of talking about sex and move into the area of abortion. Now, one of the articles assigned for you in your textbook was asked the question about personhood. How do you know who a person is? Let me give you that chapter exactly. So the title of that chapter by Gary Gutting is On Abortion and Defining a Person. And remember, I ask you to do that. And I ask you as we talk about abortion to keep in mind how you would define a person. And how did you define personhood when we were talking about end of life issues? And then I gave you another article to read, Think Before You Breed. And, you know, both of these articles, I hope, raise some good questions for you as we approach this. But let's go back, and before we talk about abortion, let's talk about contraception. And of course, there are various types of contraception. There are condoms, which are the most common, of course. There's IUDs. There's tubal ligation. There's vasectomy. There's Depo-Provera. There's the pill. There are any number of types of contraception that we could talk about. But just as I was talking about just a moment ago about the Roman Catholic view of original sin, and I didn't get into all the stuff about Mary and how Jesus could be born without sin so much, but why then would the Roman Catholic Church have a view that contraception is wrong? The Roman Catholic Church views contraception as sinful and wrong because it contravenes nature. So in essence, what contraception does is it prevents what would naturally happen between the sperm and an egg. So whatever would happen between the sperm and the egg is natural as it comes together. And anything that comes in between that is considered to contravene nature or contravene the will of God. So condoms then contravene nature. The pill contravenes nature. Even coitus interruptus contravenes nature. And coitus interruptus, by the way, is withdrawal. And so these things are considered to be wrong because they are not natural. You are interfering with the natural act of sex and what it should. This is a natural law type of ethic here, married with the idea of religion. And so anytime that you do that and you contravene the natural act, then it becomes sinful and wrong, which is why abstinence is the only safe option. Now, I want to say more about contraception and how it relates to women, and ask the question: why are most forms of contraception geared toward women and so few geared toward men? We'll talk more about that in just a moment. But when we define abortion, we are talking about the termination of a pregnancy, whether you believe that is a fetus, whether you believe it's an embryo, whether you believe that it's a person. Um, when we define abortion, we are essentially talking about the termination of a pregnancy and whether or not that is acceptable, whether or not that is okay. Um, and so we asked some, before I give you kind of a history, I do want to give you a brief history of abortion. Um, we should raise some issues. What is abortion ever acceptable? Um, in the lead up to the last into the lead up to the 2016 presidential campaign, Donald Trump was asked, should there be punishment for abortion? And he said yes, not only for the doctors but for women, that women should be punished for abortion. And so, should all abortion be banned? Are there occasions when abortion would be acceptable? So what about in the instance of rape, incest? What about for the life of the mother? What about in the instance of severe birth defects of the fetus? What about if a woman is pregnant with twins and one of those is viable and the other might not be? And if you leave the unviable one there, it threatens the life of the viable one. Would that be acceptable in those instances to abort? Of course, the question, of course, then gets into other things. What about abortion as a form of contraception? Is the morning after pill an act of abortion? The reason it's opposed is because it's seen as a contraception that contravenes the act of nature. But is it a form of contraception that is acceptable? What about for other things? What about for sex selection? If a couple says, no, we've got 3 girls, we want a boy, or no, we've got 3 boys, we want a girl. Is that ever okay to have an abortion for those for those reasons? So those are just some questions to consider. But I want to give you a little bit more of a history of abortion. Give me just one moment to find my list here. Just one moment. I am going to post for you in your material for this week a papal encyclical from Pope Paul VI called Of Human Life, Humanae Vitae. So I'll be posting that for you. It's a long read, it's a difficult read, it's a very technical, theological read, but I will post that for you so that you can see the church's official position on this. But let me give you a little history of abortion, just so that you can you know that this is not a new issue, that humans have been dealing with abortion or somehow discussing abortion for a long time. So going back as far as 3000 BCE, the Chinese had techniques for abortion that are recorded. So, we know that abortion has been around for at least 5,000 years, if not longer. We also know that in ancient Egypt, there were various types of contraception, and they also had such as gummy substances, like honey, sodium carbonate, and of course crocodile dung. That's what's one of my favorite. Crocodile dung was used as a as a form of contraception for women. So we know that in ancient Egypt, they practiced abortion. They also had contraception. Aristotle thought that birth control should be used to prevent cities from getting too large. The Hippocratic Oath mentions, and I posted that for you last week, mentions abortion. And so, you know, we know that this is going back to 400 BCE, that the ancient Greeks had knowledge of abortion. So we know that it was happening. Because they were saying we're not going to do it. If we fast forward, so what about during the time of Jesus? What did Jesus actually say about abortion? You know, if the ancient Greeks knew about it, the ancient Romans knew about it, the Egyptians, what did Jesus say? Absolutely nothing. There is no record of Jesus ever saying anything about abortion, even though certainly it was known. It's only by the time we get to the early first century, there is some discussion, or second century, there is some discussion about abortion in early Christian documents, and it is concerned more so, are you trying to use an abortion to conceal adultery or fornication? And if that's the case, shame on you. But for other reasons, it doesn't necessarily condemn abortion. By the time we get to the 3rd century, the early church writer Tertullian talks about abortion quite openly, saying that there are methods that he is familiar with, a copper needle or spike or blade or a hook device. And these are mentioned, again, quite openly. If we fast forward even beyond that, we know that there were herbal contraceptions throughout the Middle Ages and herbal forms of abortion. We know that during the Middle Ages that there have been aborted fetuses found in places where convents and monasteries were together, that is monks and nuns, not supposed to be having sex, but we know that there have been fetuses unearthed and there's evidence that they were aborted. Not only that, we know from just history that there have been times during medieval times that there were acts of abortion and infanticide. We know that did happen. There's a Persian physician who in the 12th century wrote this when it comes to contraception. When the male does come apart from her, he should order her to have a good shake 7 times. So this is a form of contraception that is encouraged in Islamic literature. And it says, when they get up, he should again make her expel the semen. For this, he should cause her to sneeze. So sneezing was a form of contraception in the Persian world in the 12th century. Thomas Aquinas is the first one to begin to speculate on something called ensoulment. So now we're talking in 1318, Thomas Aquinas believed that there was a period in where God would give a soul to the fetus, and that happened in Aquinas's ideas at about the 30-day mark. So up until that 30-day period, abortion was perfectly fine, especially if you knew about the pregnancy. But after 30 days, no, it had a soul. Now, this is eventually going to become codified as church teaching. In the 1540s, when England broke, the Church of England broke with the Roman Catholic Church, abortion was not outlawed. So in English law, it was not against the law for abortion. By the time we get to the 18th century, so the 1700s, condoms were being sold in pubs and barbershops and apothecaries and markets and theaters throughout Europe, Russia, and spread into the Americas. In fact, the largest distributor of condoms was a factory owned by Mrs. Perkins and Mrs. Phillips in England. In his autobiography, so in the 1750s, Casanova wrote about his sexual affairs and referred to condoms as the little preventative bags invented by the English to save the fair sex from anxiety. So they knew that they were preventing pregnancy by doing this. Also, Casanova would encourage his sexual partners to use halved lemons as cervical caps so that the acid would kill the sperm. John Stuart Mill, a philosopher in the 1800s, wrote that using a condom was no more than using an umbrella on a rainy day, and that all other method, that he preferred the withdrawal method, however, because all the other methods were offensive to the delicacy of women. Take it up to the 19th century, so in 1821 in Connecticut, there was a Connecticut law that was passed that restricted abortion in the United States, and that was the first. So in 1821, did not come about because of Roman Catholicism, but came about because they believed that when a woman was quick with child, that is pregnant, quick with child, the pregnancy should not be terminated. It wasn't until 1869 that the Roman Catholic Church officially condemned abortion in any form. And my voice is giving out. Give me just one moment. So before 1869, it was perfectly fine for an abortion to take place before ensoulment. That is, before the fetus had a soul. And somehow Thomas Aquinas, had come up with that arbitrary date of 30 days after pregnancy or after conception. In 1873, the Comstock Law criminalized contraception and abortion in the United States, except when a physician deemed that it was necessary. But we know that abortions continue to happen because in the early 20th century, women wouldn't use the word abortion. They would refer to things such as bringing on their course, having it done, getting fixed up, or getting straight. So this is recorded in literature in the early 20th century. And some of the forms of abortion that women would use when they weren't able to obtain the services of a physician was that women would use things such as knitting needles, crochet hooks, hairpins, scissors, button hooks. I believe that's for shoes, to induce abortion, but that would also often lead to physical harm and sometimes even death for women. In the 1920s, the US Post Office tried to stop the selling of contraceptions and any type of promotion of abortion services or equipment that was being sold. Also in the 1920s is when that we first discovered the human ovulation, so that women ovulated, and so Planned Parenthood then promoted a calendar so that women could track their cycles, and the rhythm method became much more common. In the 1930s, because of the Great Depression, there were many more abortions that were happening during that time. In fact, in the 1930s in the United States, almost 700,000 abortions were performed in the 1930s. So again, because of the sorry, I had to pause that for just a moment. As a result of the Great Depression, we do know that that abortions increase, and also contraceptions also increased during the Great Depression for obvious reasons. Demand for abortion increased so much that it was the first time that doctors began to specialize in abortion in New York and places on the West Coast. I mentioned before the Kinsey report was published in the 40s and 50s. And so Kinsey said in his report, there is more difficulty in locating abortionists today than there used to be. The laws have made it more difficult to find a physician who will perform it, and that has raised the cost of abortions. So Kinsey is aware that people are looking for abortions, and it is permissible in many states, at least at that point. In 1959, a medical technician, Patricia McGinnis, invented a do-it-yourself abortion procedure so that women could do it at home. It's in 1965 that the pill is invented, of course, as a form of contraception for women, but it is available only to married women and only with a doctor's prescription. So that is in 1965. And that, of course, sparks what is sometimes referred to as the sexual revolution in the 1960s. Of course, Playboy had come on the scene in the 1950s, but by the 1960s, Playboy is really promoting the sexual revolution in lots of ways. It's in 1973 that Roe v. Wade was handed down from the Supreme Court. And it was determined there that women had a right to privacy because it was their own body, and a woman's decision whether or not to terminate her pregnancy lay with the woman only, not with states. It didn't legalize. That's one of the misnomers sometimes. It said it legalized abortion. No, abortion was legal in lots of places. It just said that you can't prohibit all abortion. Of course, now we know nowadays that there's an effort to basically restrict abortion in certain states by making it so difficult for a woman to receive an abortion that essentially it outlaws it in lots of places. In some places, there are maybe one clinic. The other thing that I should point out, however, is that clinics are not the only places where abortions can take place. In certain instances, many instances, they can be done privately in other doctors' offices, OB-GYN's offices, and they can be done in hospitals. It's just to have specific clinics designated for that. In some places, for example, the state of Mississippi, I think there's only one. A state like Oklahoma, there's only, I think, one. And some other states, there might only be one place for an abortion. There are a couple of other points that I wanted to bring up. Let me find my notes here. We talked about the 4 questions for moral sex. Let's see. Yes. So I wanted to just, what does the Bible say? Because that's sometimes a question. Technically, the Bible does not really mention abortion at all. However, one wonders if it does promote infanticide, because in Psalm 137, verse 9, it speaks of blessed is the one who dashes the heads of the little ones against a stone. So that almost seems to indicate, I mean, if you're going to take one text to articulate the idea of original sin, you could almost take that one text and say that the Bible endorses infanticide. Of course, I'm not endorsing that by any way. But then just also a word about being pro-life. Sometimes people, I wonder if they're pro-life or if they're pro-birth. Pro-life does mean that you believe in the sanctity of life from natural contraception until the point of natural death. So you would not then adhere to any type of hastening of the end of life, whether that is due to illness or whether that is for the cause of justice, as in the death penalty. You also would do things to protect life during the course of that life. So many people, when they talk about being pro-life, I think what they actually mean is they're pro-birth, not pro-life. They just believe that children should be born, not necessarily that that they believe that those lives should be protected after they're born. And so that gets me to some questions which can expand the abortion debate. And these questions were put forth by Judith Jarvis Thompson and Allison Yeager. And so these are 6 questions to consider. What kinds of pressure are brought to bear on women in sexual encounters that initiate unplanned pregnancies? So what type of pressures are brought to bear on women in the sexual encounter that initiate unplanned pregnancies? Number 2, why do women why do women not insist on contraception? Is it because of lack of information? Is it the unaffordability? Or are they simply not in a position to insist? I was listening to Dave Letterman interview Melinda Gates the other night, and she was talking about in places in parts of Africa where women want a shot of Depo-Provera to prevent pregnancy, because they don't have to ask their husbands to use condoms, because to use a condom would seem to accuse your husband of being unfaithful, or it would seem to admit that you have been unfaithful. So why do women not insist on contraception? Sometimes it's lack of information, unaffordable, or they simply are not in a position to insist on it. Why are most contraceptive methods directed at women rather than men's bodies? So I mentioned this just a moment ago. Why do so many men refuse to use condoms, or why do men refuse vasectomies? Vasectomies can be reversed, guys. So to always insist that it's a woman's responsibility to prevent pregnancy is that right? Is that moral? Is that the right position to take when there are contraceptions that men can use beyond just condoms, and that is vasectomy? In fact, if you have a vasectomy and use a condom, you're pretty good. So why do we always insist that it's women who have to go about that? When it takes 2 to conceive a child, why are women primarily responsible for child rearing? So, why? But of course, that raises the question: do men have any say then if a woman decides that they want to have an abortion. So number 5, why is there so little public support for children in terms of family services, housing, healthcare, and childcare? So this goes back to what I was saying about people being pro-birth, not necessarily pro-life, because there is so little public support for children, for family services, housing, healthcare, and childcare. Why don't we have a national childcare program? It just makes no sense in a country as wealthy and having as much as ours. And then a question that kind of opens up, it does relate to abortion. Why do full-time employed women still earn about 2/3 of what full-time employed men earn? So there's still a disadvantage for women than, whether or not they have children. Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up there, but I am giving you a couple of handouts online. I'm posting them. One is the Humanae Vitae, is the papal encyclical from Paul VI. You have 2 articles in your textbook to read. I'm also giving you one that's quite challenging, Abortion as a Sacrifice to Artemis. So I'm offering you that one just as kind of an extra read to broaden what you're thinking about. And then finally, I'm giving you a chapter called Choices in Reproduction, where it lays out the pro and con views of abortion. So you'll have those posted in the section there. All right, guys, thanks so much, and you have a good day.